Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're continuing to talk about cultural patterns and processes in Unit 3. And today we're going to specifically talk about cultural diffusion and what are the different ways we categorize cultural diffusion, and also look at this idea of cultural hearths. So when we talk about culture, and last time in our last video we were talking about really different groupings of cultures and how we identify them kind of geographically. So we know that all culture has to come from somewhere. It has to start with a particular group of people who develop certain ideas and about the ways to communicate, or things to believe about the world, or ways to interact with each other, or clothes to wear, or whatever. And so as we look back across history, what's happened is historians and archaeologists and cultural geographers have identified a couple places around the world where they believe that culture began. And really we're looking at the places, not really just culture begins, but also civilization. When we talk about civilization, we're talking about advanced human society, and of course a lot of that's going to come in conjunction with agricultural development and things along those lines. So there's a lot of things that kind of come together and create this perfect storm. And if you study history, if you're a student of history, archaeology, anthropology, any of those types of things, you'll a lot of times find that a lot of history and culture and things that we look at come from these specific places. And so I'll just run down the list, and you can think, and there's a map on the next slide, and you can kind of think about where each of these are. We have what's called Andean America in the Andes Mountains of Peru. You have Mesoamerica, which is generally considered southern Mexico, near the Yucatan Peninsula. West Africa, typically considered along the Niger River. The Nile River Valley, of course, in Egypt. Mesopotamia, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, typically considered to be along the Tigris and Euphrates River. The Indus River Valley, which is on the western portion of India. The Ganges River Valley, which is in the eastern portion of India. It's called the Wei and the Huanghe Rivers, which is kind of easterly, north and easterly China. So again, if we think about where did cultures originate and where did civilizations originate, we'll pull out my pen. If I have my pen, I thought I had. There's my pens. Okay. So again, you think about, we had Mesoamerica, Andean America, Western Africa, over in this general area, the Nile River Valley, Mesopotamia. Oops, you know what? Mesopotamia, that's wrong. Don't want to add any more to the geographic illiteracy of the world. It may or may not let me erase it. So sometimes it won't let me erase it. Anyway, so Mesopotamia is here. Sorry, not Saudi Arabia, but Iraq and Jordan. We have over here, we have the Indus River Valley is over this way. The Ganges River Valley is over here. The Wei and the Huanghe Rivers, those are kind of in this general northeasterly area of China. And so if we look at these particular places and that I was just referring to, and we looked at our list there, one of the things I always try to point out to my students is, if you'll notice, that none of these cultural hearths are in the United States, and none of them are in Western Europe. So this is really important to think about. If you think historically where cultures and identities have come from historically, none of them came from the United States. None of them came from Western Europe. So you think about, in today's world, what is the prevailing and dominant cultures in the world, this idea of pop culture and Christianity and things that have really taken over the world. A lot of people consider, well, Christianity was really influenced the world because of European colonization. Those did not really emerge until much later as a result of the age of exploration, the economic domination of the United States, especially after World War II. And so it's definitely, there's an ebb and flow to history, and that's one of those things that we have to understand. It's always helpful to look back at history and see what places in the world have been historically significant in terms of culture and the spread of culture and those types of things. So when we look at culture and those cultural hearths, because of course if we're talking about culture, we look at these places where culture began, and we look at how does it get from these select places to the other parts of the world, and how does it kind of spread out? Well, we characterize those as different parts of cultural diffusion. So what we're looking at is, when I talk about cultural diffusion, of course I have the review video that you can go check out. So we're just talking about the way in which culture spreads across space and then also across time, because depending on the space and the time that you're looking at, culture is going to spread in different kinds of ways. So not only do we want to look at how does it spread across the space, the geographic space, but we also want to look at the time component there in terms of what happens over time. And of course, we know that today culture is able to spread in much shorter amounts of time over a much larger space because of the technology and wealth advancements that we've had in our world today. So when we look at the different types of cultural diffusion, the way we categorize them, we have what's called expansion diffusion and relocation diffusion. And so expansion and relocation diffusion are two different categories of diffusion. And when we look at these two categories, we have, again, expansion diffusion, relocation diffusion. Expansion diffusion is the way we can categorize it is this, the textbooks like to talk about it as a snowballing process, and it continues to pick up steam and things like that. I also like to think of expansion diffusion as what happens in a place when people are coming into contact with each other, and the ideas and culture spread through that contact as people begin to pick up on things. And when we look at expansion diffusion, we have three different types. We have what's called stimulus diffusion, contagious diffusion, and hierarchical diffusion. And we categorize them based upon the way that the spread happens. So again, when we look at expansion diffusion, it's this idea that something is spreading between people to new places, and it's going to spread and remain strong both in the hearth and in the new place where the culture is being picked up on. Okay, and so that's going to be a significant idea to understand, is that not only does it spread to a new place, but it's going to remain strong in the hearth. It's not going to die off in that cultural hearth. So the first kind we have here is the first type of expansion diffusion we'll talk about is what's called stimulus diffusion. Stimulus diffusion is when a particular cultural idea spreads, and it's going to be adapted. The way some of the textbooks talk about it is that part of the idea of culture is spread, but not the whole thing. And so the way I talk about it is that the cultural trait is adapted to a specific geographic and cultural context. The Human Mosaic textbook talks about the idea of domestication, and how as people were domesticating plants and animals, you had people traveling around and maybe trading and things like that, and they saw that certain animals were domesticated, and they said, we don't have pigs or sheep in our area, maybe we have reindeer. And so they went back to places that were a little bit colder, where sheep and pig couldn't survive, and they began to try to domesticate some of the animals that did exist, whether it's horses or reindeer or whatever. And then, of course, in drier places, maybe camels and things like that, as they saw this idea of domestication as they were traveling around and trading. So it's like, again, it's the idea that in that context, domestication spreads, not maybe necessarily the domestication of goats and pigs, because people didn't have goats and pigs where they were living, but the idea of domestication as they tried to domesticate some of the animals they had in their particular area. We have what's called contagious diffusion, and that's going to start off with people near the node or the center or the hearth or wherever something is happening. And really, contagious diffusion is characterized by something spreading very rapidly out into the general population. When we think contagious, we always think of some sort of disease or something like that. And disease isn't necessarily always contagious, but really it's more along the lines of that it's indiscriminate in the way that it spreads. It spreads to all people. It can be male, it can be female, it doesn't matter of socioeconomic status. It just gets out into the general population, and it spreads relatively quickly. I like to think about silly bands, which were a hot item several years ago, especially with younger students. They're an economically accessible thing for students to purchase. They're very cheap. Pretty much anybody can get them, and they spread very rapidly through the population. You think about things on YouTube and how things on the internet go viral. Again, information on the internet is relatively accessible to most people, and so if something goes out there, then a lot of people can get a hold of it, and so it becomes kind of this contagious factor of diffusion. The last one we have was called hierarchical diffusion. And again, we're talking about the spread of culture, so of course it's going to be things like ideas, information, and cultural traits. But the important thing about hierarchical is if you look at the root word there, this hierarchy, we're talking about something that's going to start with a person of importance or prestige, somebody that people look to whether it's celebrities, whether it's a politician, person of religious importance. So, of course, if you think about the Catholic Church, the Pope, things that he says in terms of his understanding of Scripture, or any type of social initiatives that he might take on, and it begins to filter down typically into the general population. You go from the most important person to the next important, and it kind of filters down to general society. I think about Oprah a lot of times when we talk about hierarchical diffusion, because she was the person who communicated with large numbers of people, what was considered good writing. She helped Dr. Phil get his start, and so everybody believes Dr. Phil because Oprah pretty much just lends herself to Dr. Phil, and because she says he can be trusted, he becomes trusted. And again, a lot of people acted on what exactly Oprah told him to. So anytime a book was on Oprah, it was a bestseller because Oprah, by golly, said that it was a good book. So the very next day, all the moms in the United States went out and bought the book that she told them to buy. And so that she is that person of importance. Now, some people might say that's contagious because it happens relatively rapidly, but you think about it, it's starting with that person of importance, and really it's dependent on whether or not you cared about who Oprah was. I frankly did not care anything about Oprah or what she had to say or her books or anything like that. I certainly would have gone on her show to get one of those free gifts. I don't know anybody who wouldn't. But again, it's going to be for a select group of people, and so that's why I consider it to be a hierarchical form of diffusion. And I forgot to push the button. But anyway, so again, it's going to spread. And when it says spreads with importance, I'm talking about spreads in terms of importance to the person in relationship to that node or that figurehead. The last type of diffusion we have is relocation diffusion. And again, you look at the term there, to relocate. So that's basically the characteristic of that type of diffusion. It involves the actual movement of a person to a new place, and that is how their particular elements of culture are going to spread. And so it spreads from the hearth to a new place, and then you get the diffusion of the culture in that new place with that particular person. So you think about it like this. If culture is going to move to a new geographic location, especially in more traditional times, it required relocation diffusion. Once that person got to the place, then it would spread to the general population of that new place through a different form of expansion diffusion. So the movement across space is relocation. Once they're in that space, it spreads through expansion. Now the way that it's different today is that you can have cultural diffusion without the movement of a person to a new place. You think about television, American television going to other parts of the world. No American has to step foot in a foreign country to tell them about different American traits, whether it's WWF wrestling, or it is McDonald's, or it is Ronald McDonald, or it is some type of Justin Bieber or whoever. No American has to go these places. The people in the foreign countries see it on the television. They see it on the internet. So you no longer have to have that relocation diffusion occur before the other types of diffusion will take place. And there's a great video on the country of Bhutan. I believe Frontline did it. I believe it was Frontline did it. It was when Bhutan first got the television. And you got to see the impact on the Bhutanese people getting television, what happens there, and then the way that the children start to adopt certain heroes that are part of the WWF. So it's pretty funny. You think about WWF and all the corniness that's involved, and a lot of people kind of roll their eyes, but WWF is actually one of the more popular sports in the United States. So anyway, and some people might actually say that, but not sport. I guess it's not WWF now anymore. It's now WWE. So my apologies to those of you who are hardcore fans of professional wrestling.